Okay, so we're going to continue on with our water quality lecture, and we're going to focus on salinity. So what is salinity? Salinity is the concentration of salt in water and ranges between 0 parts per trillion and 30 parts per trillion. What does that mean? So to give a concrete example as far as parts per trillion, that means that let's say you have a glass of water and it's salt water. For every 1 million molecules, 30 of those molecules are salt. And salt itself is a combination of both a metal and a non-metal. And that's what you're seeing. Color. That's what you're seeing here, right? So this chloride and this sodium, before it was in water, it was together based on an ionic bond. And you know that ionic bonds are weaker compared to covalent bonds. As a reminder, covalent bonds form between two nonmetals. With an ionic bond, once a salt enters a water or any sort of liquid that's very polar, because of the number of molecules of water, that amount of polarity pulls apart both of those atoms. So it pulls apart that compound, breaks it apart, and so now you have your chloride here, which is negative, and you have your sodium here, which is positive, and they're all floating around mixed in with all of these water molecules. Something else that you'll notice that I did not mention in our class is this little symbol here and this little symbol here. This is referring to the polarity of water itself and the parts that these ions are attracting to it, right? So for example, with chloride, it has a -1 charge. This means that there's one valence electron, and that valence electron is attracting the positive charge that is on the hydrogen parts of our water molecule. So that's why you see all of the blue that's facing the chloride molecule. For our sodium molecule, it's attracting the negative parts of our water molecule, which is what you're seeing here. Remember, our water molecule is H2O. This is the O. And oxygen molecules, as a reminder, have 2 valence electrons. And so because of that, the 2 valence electrons are attracted to the one positive, larger sodium molecule. It's not larger, sorry about that. So it's attracted to the sodium molecule, which makes sense because negative is attracted to positive and vice versa. Okay, so sources of salt. One source is from urban runoff, and that is when stormwater basically sends minerals from soil and other particles to the nearest waterway. This includes when you're talking about a watershed, and it can happen, of course, in an urban or a natural environment. If you're talking about an urban environment, one really good case is during a snowfall or after a snowfall. We like to put a lot of salt on our grounds to keep from slipping and to melt the snow. And as that snow melts, it's taking the salt with it, and it will melt either into the nearest storm drain or catch basin, as well as to the nearest waterway. So that will increase the salinity of a body of water. Another is the ions from groundwater. So I mentioned before during our class that groundwater are basically underwater streams and water in and of itself that's in the soil. And New York City actually has a lot of that, because remember that New York City, for a lot of the coastlines, those were wetlands. and those wetlands, they were saturated and oversaturated with water and eventually created those underwater streams. So that is what you are looking at here. And finally, we have ions from erosion. So think back to the phosphorus cycle where our rainwater that's slightly acidic falls and eventually falls down into either the nearest rocks or the nearest mountain, if we were to live near mountains, and it weathers it away, basically. And it ends up sending a lot of those minerals down to the nearest waterway, including that phosphorus that we talked about before, and that will also increase the salinity. One that we did not talk about is this, evapotranspiration. So this is an indirect way for salt to, or salinity concentration to increase. So take, for example, if you have a glass of salted water, right? And let's say the salinity is 20 parts per trillion. As you leave that glass sitting there, right, water, of course, will start to evaporate because that's what water does. It's taking in energy and in order to increase its heat. And as it's increasing its heat, water molecules are evaporating into the atmosphere. As that is happening, for the most part, with the exception of chloride, because chloride does actually evaporate into the atmosphere along with that water, but the sodium molecules in particular, they stay in the water. So if you have water molecules, if you have less water molecules in your glass of salt water, because some of them have evaporated into the atmosphere, but you have the same number of sodium ions, therefore you have a higher concentration of salt, or you'll have a higher salinity concentration. So like I said, indirect way for salinity to increase. Now, how does salinity relate to aquatic life, right? So most aquatic organisms can really only tolerate a limited range of salinity, very similar to our pH discussion. This is based on the type of osmotic process of the organism's cells. So for example, we have a hyperosmotic cell. This is a cell's ability to eliminate water and retain ions, and it's typically found in fresh water. So to kind of backtrack a little bit, osmosis refers to the diffusion of water, and it is based on the number of solutes in a cell as well as outside of the cell, which then affects the concentration of water. So when we're talking about a hyperosmotic cell, this means that it's really good at making sure that the cell eliminates water and that it retains its ions, right? Those minerals it needs to survive. Why is this important for a freshwater fish? It's in a body of water that does not have a huge amount of ions in it already. And so because of that, those cells, if left to its own devices without the mechanisms needed to be hyperosmotic, water would end up rushing into that cell. Because of the cell's organelles, it is able to keep pushing out that excess water so that that fish itself can survive and also remain buoyant in that water. Now, hypoosmotic. This is the cell's ability to maintain low ion concentration while retaining water. And this is typically found in saltwater organisms. So again, why is this important? Same exact reason, but reversed. Because this fish exists in salty water, there's more salt outside of the fish than there is inside of the fish, which means that the amount of, if the cell was left to its own devices, the water that's inside of that fish, because there is less salt compared to outside of it, that water will diffuse, would normally diffuse out into the ocean, for example, or brackish water. However, again, this fish, its cells, has the organelles to make sure that it retains that water. That way, it doesn't get dehydrated, right? Which is actually a really awesome feature to have. So what you're seeing here are just a very small sample of the types of fish and the kinds of things that the kinds of water bodies that they live in. It goes from salt water here to fresh water. Notice it's in blue. But one thing I do want you to take note of are these organisms right here. So these organisms, and actually this one too, because this is kind of like I've referred to it as the cockroach of the sea, of the brackish water, because it can kind of live anywhere. These fish that I've circled, including carp, and actually excluding marlin, and I'll actually correct that. Let me correct this. Okay, I will redraw this. There we go. Okay, so these fish that I have circled, they can live really in more brackish water, right? So the salinity is not quite as high as ocean water. Reminder, ocean water is 25 parts per trillion. Brackish water can really range between 5 to 20. But again, that fish will be adapted to its environment. If that salt concentration changes too much, it can get in trouble.